Okay, starting with the 2019 paper, question number 6 lamai. Okay, what is the GDP deflator and what are the major differences between the GDP deflator and the Colombo Consumer Price Index? So remember guys, now, okay, first thing, before you answer or get into anything, first you need to figure out how many marks are they going to give. Okay, so the question has two parts. What is the GDP deflator? So maybe for something like this, out of 4 marks, they can either give us 1 mark or maybe 2 marks. 1 or 2. They are not going to give 3 or 4 marks for what is the GDP deflator. And then what are the major differences between the GDP deflator and the Colombo Consumer Price Index? Okay. So this looks like now if they give 1 mark for the first part, they might give, let's say, 3 marks for this. If they give 2 marks for the first part, they might allocate 2 marks for this. Now, we don't know when we get the paper, we don't know how the marking scheme looks like. So we need to make an assumption. So then remember what have I told you? Based on that, you answer it for the highest mark. You answer what is GDP deflator for 2 marks, right? Thinking that it's a 2 mark question. Give the differences, thinking that it's a 3 mark question. So then either way, however they allocate marks, you get the full marks. That has to be your strategy. So then what is GDP deflator? How are we going to answer this for 2 marks, Lamai? What can we say about the GDP deflator? Can you give me a few things for 2 marks? GDP deflator. What and what can we write? You all would have seen this GDP deflator coming into play when we calculate nominal GDP, real GDP, that thing. Okay. Helps to measure the real GDP of the year. Okay, fine, absolutely correct. Anything else that you all can give in to maybe make your answer a little better? So guys, so what does the GDP deflator do, Lamai? The GDP deflator helps to, do what? Helps to, okay, deflate the nominal GDP, correct, right? So you can say, guys, right, the GDP deflator helps in doing what? It's a measure. Okay, now I am writing short forms. When you're writing answers, write nice full answers. Okay, you say GDP deflator is a economic measure that does what? That, let's say, helps to do what? Helps in converting the nominal GDP. Helps in converting the nominal GDP of a country. Nominal GDP of a country to what? Okay, in other words, its output. What do? They convert this output to the prices of a base year. Now, in the nominal GDP, your output is multiplied by that year's prices. No? Yeah, that is what happens in nominal GDP. No, this year, rice output 100 kilos multiplied by the price of rice this year. That's how you get nominal GDP. So what they do is they convert this nominal GDP, right, of a country to the prices, right, of a base year. In other words, what do they do, Lamai? This helps with calculating something called the real GDP. You can write this in different ways, okay? But the main thing for 1 mark, you need to give a small definition, Lama. You need to say what is GDP deflator. You can talk about that how this helps to convert the nominal GDP into the real GDP. It takes into account the base year prices and it removes the inflationary impact on the goods. Okay, you get 1 mark. Remember, we are writing this for 2 marks. Can you tell me what else can I do now? Now I've got 1 mark by giving a small definition. What else? Three-letter word, prices. What else? You can give the equation now. You can say GDP deflator equals, right? GDP deflator equals your nominal GDP divided by the real GDP. Okay. Now see, knowing how many marks they might give helps us know. Now, not that you all don't know this equation. You all know the equation. No? This is something you can also multiply it by 100 to get a percentage. Okay. See, that's why always I tell you, Lamai, especially practice this when we are doing the mock exams also. Whenever you get a question, break it down. In your head, you have to imagine, okay, how many marks is the examiner going to give? And you answer it for the highest marks possible. Okay. So now even if the examiner gives 1 mark for what is GDP deflator, even if they give 2 marks for what is GDP deflator, you can get this mark. Yeah. Difference between nominal GDP and real GDP is, now how do you calculate GDP? It's the output that you produce, okay, multiplied by the price level, no? So in nominal GDP, what happens is you take this year's output, multiply it by this year's prices, current prices. Nominal GDP is also called GDP at current price. So for example, last year, 2022, when we had very high levels of inflation, our nominal GDP would have been very high last year. So output, because multiplied by the current year prices, bread which was 50 rupees earlier, last year it was, let's say, 150 rupees. So nominal GDP would have been very high. But to eliminate that, now if you look at nominal GDP and if you say, oh, look here, our nominal GDP went up, wow, this is a good thing. But actually what would have happened is prices are the reason it went up. So therefore, to get a better measure only, we calculate real GDP. So in real GDP, what you do, you take the output of the current year, you multiply it by the base year prices. In other words, you're deflating the goods. You're not multiplying it by the current year prices. You have a base year. Now our base year is there. You multiply it by the base year and then you get the GDP. That's what you call the real GDP. In other words, from the nominal GDP, you're removing the inflationary effect. Okay, you're removing the inflationary effect. So that's how you get the real GDP. Prices goes up, then real output nominal. In the real GDP, there are no price changes, guys. If the real GDP has increased from one year to another year, that is mainly because the That is mainly because the output has gone. But if nominal GDP increase, that can happen because of so many other reasons. Okay, is that fine? Okay. Then can you all give me, guys, the differences between this? Yes, now the inflation base year is 2021. Okay. Now, differences between GDP deflator and the Colombo consumer price. We'll write 3. Then we can get our 3 marks if they give 3. Can you all tell me? Now, both of these are measuring inflation, but what are the differences? Now, the Colombo Consumer Price Index, guys, covers only what? The price levels of goods and services in the Colombo district and the urban areas of Colombo, right? That's why we call it the Colombo Consumer Price. So Colombo Consumer Price Index, right? You can talk about the geographical coverage first. This covers what? This covers only, right? Covers only Colombo and the suburbs. Okay. So while the GDP deflator covers what? It covers the prices of the entire economy, right? Covers the prices of the entire economy. What else can we say, Lama? Okay, that is one difference. Now you'll get 1 mark for that. Can we give some other differences apart from those? Colombo Consumer Price Index and the deflator. What can you tell about the basket of goods, Lama? Now, in the Colombo Consumer Price Index, remember when I teach you all CCPI, NCPI, I told you all how do they calculate inflation, Lama? There is a basket of goods, no? You look at, okay, how much is the basket of goods now? How much is the basket of goods next month? You put that into index, you can calculate inflation. That's how you calculate NCPI and CCPI. No? So this basket of goods, Lamai, doesn't have all the goods. It only has certain goods and services. You go and see in the latest things like 2021. Remember I showed you all the new base year. There is that table. In that table, can you all tell me, guys, how many goods does the CCPI cover? If I'm not mistaken, 309 90 something. Anyone who has that table? Colombo Consumer Price Index. What is the amount of goods in the basket that is there? Can you all do a check? I can't remember the exact number. If I'm not mistaken, 392. Okay. So Colombo Consumer Price Index, guys, covers only the prices of 392 goods. Now, just think, do you think in Colombo there are only 392 goods? Just think and see, Lamai. If you take varieties of rice, samba, kiri samba, basmati, nadu, this, that, right? Varieties of rice itself, right? Varieties of rice itself, you might have around 10. Then take the packets of, take biscuits, right? Biscuits also you might have, let's say how much? I don't know, maybe around 30, 40. Okay. So if you in reality take, there are maybe 10,000, 20,000 goods, right? But it's not only 392, no. I think 426, I think it's for the national consumer price. Now it's 426. The new one, all basic. All right, okay. So then now it's 420. Now see, now just practically think, Lamai, is there only 426 goods in Colombo? No. There are so many, right? But this national consumer pricing, Colombo Consumer Price Index will only cover, new base year 426, will only cover the goods and prices of goods and services of 426 goods. Now, if the prices of some other goods that is not in this basket go up, the CCPI won't show that. Let's say, for example, okay, tuition classes are actually there. Let's say, okay, for example, we'll assume, assumption, okay, we'll assume tuition classes are not inside the basket. Okay, it's actually there. Okay, we'll assume that it's not in the basket in Colombo Consumer Price Index. Now, let's say I increase my tuition class fee. Accordingly, all other teachers also increase. But our inflation won't go up. Our inflation won't go up because that is not captured in the basket. See, that's a limitation in the Colombo Consumer and the National Consumer Price Index, both. Both of it only has a limited amount of goods and services in the basket. So there could be other goods that might not be included in this basket. Yeah, so you need to highlight that. You need to say the Colombo Consumer Price Index measures the inflation only for a certain basket of goods. You can say according to the new base year of 2021, the CCPI covers goods and services, only 426 goods and services. But if you take the GDP deflator, Lamai, the GDP deflator is an overall measure. GDP deflator is what? Is an overall measure. And you can even say this, Lamai. GDP deflator is an overall measure. And in addition to this, now if you take Colombo Consumer Price Index, okay, it might have, okay, in the basket of goods, Lamai, there is fuel. There is in the CCPI, there could be fuel, there could be, let's say, these electronics, anything. So it can have, even imported goods can be included. Colombo Consumer Price Index will even take into account imported goods. For example, all your fuel and everything. But now, that is good, huh? Because if you are really looking at inflation now, something like fuel is a very big component. But something like the GDP deflator, Lamai, okay, GDP deflator calculates GDP and deflate it. No? So in the GDP, imports are not there, Lamai. Even though the GDP deflator is an overall measure, it covers all the goods and services, it covers only the goods and services produced in Sri Lanka. GDP, all goods and services produced within geographical boundaries, inside Sri Lanka. So you can say this covers all goods and services, okay? Covers all goods and services produced in Sri Lanka. And in other words, guys, now see, is in GDP there is no imported goods, no. Remember, how do you calculate GDP? C plus I plus G, X minus M. You remove the imports. So imports are not inside the GDP. So it won't be covered in the GDP deflator. In GDP deflator, what are you doing? You're taking the nominal GDP, deflating it and getting the real GDP. So in the nominal GDP, you don't have imports. Okay. So in SL, right? So covers all the goods and it does not cover imported goods. You can say that. Why not imported services? Imported services in CCPI, kind of imported services like what? There is, right? Now, for example, telecommunication, that's an imported service in Sri Lanka. For example, dialogue and all, that's an imported service. That is there in our CCPI. Okay. In Sri Lanka, guys, we use all of this. We use CCPI, we use NCPI. Now, remember in the past paper class group, what was the latest one that I sent you? Not the latest one, the one that we don't talk about much in our syllabus. Did you all even open that picture and see a little what does that mean? You don't have to understand that 100%, but at least some idea. The producer price index, right? So producer price index, guys, that measures the cost of production. So that's a different index. Thankfully, it's not in our syllabus. So just to talk about the producer price index, what happens there is they say that the prices of goods and services is a lagged let's say indicator of the cost of production. In other words, they are saying if the cost of production goes up, eventually prices will go up. So producer price index measures the cost of production and thereby they connect it to prices. Now, for example, they will say, okay, for tuition classes, has the cost of production gone up? Let's say printing cost, electricity for physical class hall charges. Now, if that has gone up, now that is going to affect the prices of tuition classes. That's going to go up. Then let's say, for example, for a manufacturing industry, okay, there has been import restrictions, there has been this, okay, the currency has depreciated, okay, now their cost of raw materials might go up. Now that will affect the prices. That's how the producer price index looks like. It looks at the producer's perspective in terms of what is happening to his cost and how that will end up at that fellow increasing the prices. You don't have to know that in detail, don't worry. That's not in our syllabus. I have showed you that. Okay. So then, okay, right, that can be the second one. So far we find, guys, can you give me another, maybe a difference? This covers only Colombo suburbs, fine. Then this has only 426 goods, but has imported goods. This covers only all the final goods, has more. What can we say? Okay, standard of living, fine. That looks a little like our first point also. Anything even better? Wider consumer behavior shape. Okay, looks like this. I think you can give cost of living also, Lamai. No problem, right? It looks like the first point also product connected, but you can say, I'll write it on top, guys. The GDP deflator talks about the cost of living for the entire country. It covers the entire country, Lamai. Okay, so that's, I said, kind of connected to the first point, but you can write. There is nothing much, guys. There are no big differences. So these two, I feel, are your main points. Okay, so if they give you 2 marks, you'll get your 2 marks here. So you can say the GDP deflator, right, is an overall measure of the cost of living of the entire country. But if you take cost of living, it covers the entire country. But if you take, let's say, the Colombo Consumer Price Index, it only covers, let's say, the cost of living only in Colombo. And yes, you can talk about it captures wider consumer behavior. Fine. So I'm telling you, as long as you can give 3 points, enough, Lamai. Don't have to worry too much, because I told you, maximum 3 marks they can give you for this question. So 3 points should be enough. You'll get your marks. Okay. What if they ask difference between NCPI and this? That's for you to prepare. Go through the NCPI table. Go through this. See what and what makes sense. Okay. Yes, both of these by the Department of Census and Salary. Yes, GDP deflator also by them. Okay. Right, that's question number 6, part 1. This is a little bit of a tricky one, guys. All the others are usually easy. We'll go to the next one. Question number 2. Now, explain the concept of inflationary gap using a diagram. Now, see, this is a hint that the examiner gave. Now, inflationary gap, Lamai, we study this in unit number 6. Unit number 7 wala inflation gap naha. So this is a indicator or small hint the examiner said, look here, I can test. There is no 100% rule that question number 6 has to be 100% from unit number 7. If there is anything that connects with the previous ones, I can, put that over here. No? Okay. So inflation, the gap case, now they are not very clear and they have not mentioned, is it an inflationary output gap or is it an inflationary expenditure gap? So we'll mention both. Okay. So explain the concept of inflation gap using a diagram. Now these diagrams are usually complex diagrams, and there is nothing big to explain on inflation thing. No, you can't write pages and pages. So most likely how the marks would have been given is, okay, they would have given 2 marks for the diagram and 2 marks for explaining the concept. So I'll start with the diagram. So how does a what is an inflationary output gap, lamai? An inflationary gap is where your aggregate expenditure is more than the expenditure required for full employment. No. Now, for example, lamai, in an economy, this is the Y equals E line, and let's say this is the expenditure required for full employment. For example, let's assume this is your full employment level of output. Economy is at equilibrium at full employment. When do we have an inflationary gap? An inflationary gap occurs when what happens? When your expenditure is above the expenditure required for full employment. Now, this is the expenditure required for full employment. I'll just say EF. So, if your expenditure is above this, okay, I'll draw a straight line. Okay, if your expenditure is above the expenditure required to have full employment, that is what you call an inflationary gap. That's what you call an inflationary gap. So there are inflationary expenditure gaps and there is an inflationary output gap. Now in our question, we are not 100% sure, are they asking inflationary expenditure, the inflationary output? So we will show both in our diagram level. Nothing to lose, no? So we can say, look here, the inflationary expenditure gap is this. You can, let's say, mark point A and point B and say in your explanation, the gap between A and B is the inflationary expenditure gap. This is by how much expenditure exceeds than the expenditure required for full employment. So the EF curve is the expenditure that we require, the aggregate expenditure required for full employment level of output. If you have that expenditure, then you will be at equilibrium at full employment. But our aggregate expenditure is much more, right? So that gap between that is what we call the inflationary expenditure gap. This is you can consider it as the inflationary gap as well. Then lamai, what is the inflationary output gap? The inflationary output gap is, now remember the two axes, this side is expenditure, this side is output. So what I just showed, the distance between A and B is the inflationary expenditure gap. Then what is the inflationary output gap? Here, if you are at EF, you are at equilibrium methanol. But if you are at the E curve, you are at equilibrium over here. Okay, see? So your output should have been, let's say, for example, 100. But your equilibrium output is actually 120. Full employment is 100, but your equilibrium at 120. So the gap between these two, right? This is what you call, right? You will just mark X and Y will, right? Or you can say YF and YE, no problem. You can explain, yes, when you all are also explaining diagrams, lamai, always give letters and explain. That is easy. Don't now, then the examiner knows, all right, he's talking about this and this. Gap between X and Y, or gap between, okay, YF and YE, so don't say a gap between the horizontal, this thing, don't say nonsense like that. Always label it, say YF, YE, right? You can now, or after labeling, say what these are. YF is full employment level of output, YE is the actual equilibrium level, therefore the gap between these two is the inflationary output gap. Okay, is that fine, Lavan? That's what you need to explain. So you need to say inflationary gap is where the aggregate expenditure required, the actual aggregate expenditure is greater than the aggregate expenditure required for full employment. Okay, so you can mainly talk about that in your definition kind of a thing. And then The main thing of that is the diagram, lamai. So you draw the diagram and then you say, according to the diagram, okay, the gap between A and B, the gap between A and B will denote the inflationary expenditure gap. Similarly, the gap between YF and YE will denote the inflationary output gap. Should be completely fine. You should get your 4 marks. Is that okay? This comes from unit number 6 a little, lamai. Given that there is like an inflationary part, they've connected it to unit number 7 also. Same. Then the next one, inflationary output gap and expansion. You can call it expansion output gap, but don't go and write those words. We'll talk about inflation. Okay. Question 3. Very easy one, guys. See, now I told you one question can be a little new. No, now the first one, the CCPI and deflator, that was a little new one. Now, even this question, lamai, they have asked this 100 times in unit number 6. Right, the economy can be at full employment, equilibrium at full employment or unemployment, or even with inflation. Draw and explain. Right, very common question. Might have not seen this in the unit 7 questions, but easily unit 6 question. Now, even this one very easy, right? Distinguish between transaction demand for money and speculative demand for money. So for 2 marks, you talk about transaction demand for money. For 2 marks, you talk about speculative demand. Please don't draw tables and explain. Like I've said, you write it in paragraphs. So you can maybe, if you want, even give a small heading, no problem at all. Give a small heading saying transaction demand for money. Okay. Give a small heading. And then you can write what this is. Okay. You can say transaction demand for money is the money that people keep with them to fund their day-to-day transactions. This is because there is a gap between receiving income and making payments for expenditure. You receive income usually at the end of the month, but expenditure is made on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, they have to keep some money with them to cover these day-to-day expenditure. That's the transaction motive. And then you can say the amount of money people demand for the transaction motive depends on the income. And if you really want, lamai, draw the diagram and show, right? So you can draw the graph for that, right? Money demand under transaction motive, income. Look here, there is a relationship like this. This is the money demand. Okay, you get your 2 marks. And then now you're distinguishing, lamai. So then don't just say speculative, right? After saying speculative, you can say on the other hand. See, you're showing the difference, lamai. That's why you use words like that. You can say on the other hand, speculative motive for demand is the money that people keep with them to make use of, let's say, future investment opportunities. The speculative motive for demand will depend on the money that people keep, will depend on the interest rates. And then you can say there is a negative relationship, that, whatever that you know. And then if you really want a diagram, I don't think they will give marks for it, but adds a little value to your answer. Just draw the diagram, okay? Money demand for speculative motive, interest rates, there is a inverse relationship. Okay, you get your 4 marks, guys. So you said on the other hand, and you explain the difference. So that's all that is required. Can you all handle a question like this? Now these questions you all have to get full marks now. Why? You can't be losing on questions like this. Okay. Then we'll go to 4. Does inflationary gap come from a business cycle? Yeah, you can show inflationary output gap on a business cycle as well. A positive output gap. Okay. No, diagram is not necessary. Speculative demand, I explained it recently, right? In one of the recent papers. So they are in the past paper class. Sorry, if you're there in the mock exam series, just check. I went into very detail. I remember your name coming across there. Check on this Saturday. I went into detail onto speculative mode. Okay. Yeah, so your differences, Lama, you give it in a paragraph. Now remember, I told you your differences can't be in a table, okay? You have to nicely explain what is this, how does this work, right? What is the, what does it determine based on? You know, if you've given that and, you know, shown a small diagram, should be more than enough. Okay, so speculative motive in very simple terms, I'm not going into detail, Lama. Okay, how does speculative motive work is when interest rates increase, what happens? is the price of bonds. Price of bonds come down. When interest rates increase, price of bonds come down. There is an inverse relationship. I'm not going to detail how that works. Okay. When the price of bonds come down, what happens is people now buy bonds. Now, what they try to do, they try to make a capital gain. No? Buy at a lower price, sell at a higher price. So when the price of bonds come down, people will buy bonds. People are buying bonds means now the money that they have some money with them. No, they are giving away that money and buying the bond. So demand for money comes down. Now they don't have money with them. They have given that money away. So what is demand for money? Money that they have with them for what purpose? For investment purposes. Now that money is not there with them. They have given it and bought a bond. Same thing happens the other way. When interest rates come down, the price of bonds go up. So when the price of bonds go up, what do? People now sell their bonds. Okay. So when they sell their bonds, what happens? Now they get money. So when they get money, what happens? The demand for money under speculative motive goes up. Here, negative relationship between interest rates and the demand for money. That's how it goes. Money demand determine price of bonds or interest rate. Main determinant is interest rate. When there is a change in interest rate, it changes the price of bonds. Then people will buy or sell accordingly, and then that changes the demand for money. Okay, that's how it works. Go a little and see in detail. It should be there in any of your theory notes that you're studying, guys. Okay. Question 4. This is one of the easiest credit creation question that you will ever get in your paper. Okay. Usually speculators don't consider. What do you mean AVT interest rate? Speculators do consider. Now, the objective is when the interest rates go up and the price of bonds come down now, they expect that in the future, interest rates will come down and the price of bonds will go up. So they expect this to reverse in the future. That's why they buy it now. Functions of money can we also say? Not really. You can talk about the transaction demand for money. You can say let's say, correlates with the demand for money for the medium of exchange. Fine, but not a very important part. Okay, you can say speculative is for store of value. Say, even if you've not written, you can still get your full mark. Okay, then suppose that a bank customer newly deposits 10,000 in the current account and the required reserve ratio is 0.25, right? That is 25%. What are the required reserves for this new deposit? Come on, tell me. If you can't get this question done, that means you've never studied that unit 7 at all. At least not even watch that video that I asked you to watch. Which one? So how much is our required reserves? From the 10,000 that is coming in, we have to keep 0.25. In other words, 25%, 25 over 100. So how much should we keep? We have to keep a 2,500. That is our required reserve. You get 2 marks there. Okay. Then part B, what is the maximum amount of loan that the bank can grant on the basis of this new deposit? Another free 2 marks, no? So how much of what is the maximum loan that they can grant now? The maximum loan they can grant is the balance 7,500. 10,000 came, 2,500 they have to keep as required reserve. You can say 10,000 minus 2,500 required. They have 7,500 of excess reserves. This excess reserves can be given out as loans. See, that's the easiest 2 marks that you will ever find in any paper. Is there anything else? No. That's it with the credit creation. Shape lamai. Is that okay? Shape. Then we go to the last question of question number 9 to it, the 9. Explain the role of the standing rate corridor in maintaining the stability of the financial system in Sri Lanka. Right now, we have talked about this before also in some previous papers. So I'm not going to go into very detail. I'll just overall give you all the picture. Okay, so the standing rate corridor, guys, is formed. You need to start your answer by saying the standing rate corridor is formed by what rates? The standing lending facility rate and the standing deposit facility rate. So the standing lending facility rate and the standing uh, deposit facility rate. And then you can say this interest rate corridor or these two policy rates are the main signaling mechanism of the central bank of the monetary policy stance that they will be taking. So there is a monetary policy review meeting happening tomorrow. Tomorrow is the 5th, no? Yeah. On the 5th of October, there is a monetary policy review meeting happening. My prediction is that they will reduce policy rates a little bit more. Currently, it's at 11% and 12%. Currently, standing lending is at 12, deposit is at 11. These are the current rates. I feel 100 basis points cut or a 200 basis points cut is coming. Most likely, maybe 100. They might bring it down to 11 and 12. So then the rate corridor will go like this. Then they bring it down, it will go like that. So this will be 11, this will be 10. They might bring it down like that. Or they can bring it down by 200 basis points also. But more likely, I feel somewhere around 100 is the ideal number. But even a 200 thing is possible. Bit like they're not going to increase. They're either going to keep it the same or more chance, I would say 2 out of 3 probability they would reduce. We'll see how it goes. Tomorrow I'll let you all know what happened with the monetary policy review meeting. Okay. So then what does this monetary policy, what does this policy rates kind of show, Lamai? This gives the main monetary policy the signal. It's a signal saying now, for example, if they are reducing these policy rates, it's a signal that the central bank is saying, look here, we are trying to now expand the economy. We are trying to have expansionary monetary policy. That's why we are reducing this, because once you reduce this, all other rates are also controlled. So you can talk a little bit about that. You can say, how by controlling these policy rates, how they can control the uh, average weighted call money rate, how they can thereby control other short-term and long-term interest rates, and thereby how it affects the price level. You can talk a little bit about that. Yes, it can lead to inflation again, but now inflation is down. No? Inflation in September is only 1.3%. My prediction was 1.7, little lesser than my prediction. It did come to 1.3% in September. Now inflation is at even lower than what they expected. They want to have it at a mid-single digit, 4 to 6%. Now it's around 1.3 last month. This is the lowest that we will see, this year in September. Inflation, that's the one that came 2-3 days ago. Okay, last Thursday, no, that was the last day of the month. No, it was 1.3%. So only 1.3%. That means compared to last year September, this year September, prices have gone up by only 1.3%. Last year September, if something is 100 rupees, this year in September it's 101 and 30 cents. So now inflation is kind of under control. So now what they want is they want to promote economic growth, Lamai. That's why they are reducing rates. They won't mind prices going up a little bit more. That's okay. They want to promote aggregate demand now, because otherwise the economy is contracting and GDP growth is falling. Okay. Now, so then after that, now that's not the main part, guys. Then you can also say, now how does this maintain the financial stability? How does this maintain that? You need to talk about how the standing deposit and standing lending facility, how it is used a little, Lamai. So you can say, for example, commercial banks, right? After the daily auction. Now, daily auction means within the day, they will buy treasury bills, treasury bonds. They will, give loans to customers, right? They will get deposits, right? All of that will happen. And after that daily auction, if they have any, right? So after the daily auction, okay, if they have any excess liquidity overnight, that is at the end of the day, if they have any excess liquidity, they can go and put it where? Use the standing deposit facility, and they can go and deposit. See, it maintains stability in the financial system. So if there is any excess liquidity, it's absorbed. And then same thing, Lamai, after the daily auction, if you have a shortage of liquidity, if you have a shortage of liquidity, then what can you do? You can use the standing lending facility and you can borrow. And thereby what happens? By controlling the liquidity. The central bank can control the average weighted call money rates, it controls everything. You need to explain. That's all. ST and LT, short term and long term interest rates. Okay, is that fine? Again, a very common question, now standing rate corridor. Now they have been asking this for so many years. Every day they ask. Okay, 2019 questions, problems, issues. Okay,